Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time out on this Saturday afternoon to join us on this panel discussion or conversation titled Peace Now, No Nukes over South Asia. And I can sort of say, assure you that the panelists that we have here to talk about these wide-ranging issues on South Asia, you'll really be kind of saying thank you to yourself to have come here on the Saturday afternoon. Just there are not many of us here, but still one housekeeping rule, and then I'll kind of say also outline that how do we want to go about the conversation today. The only housekeeping rule is that if you already haven't put your smart or dumb device on silent mode, this is the time to do so, and so that those wonderful ringtones don't distract our conversation. Besides that, so this is 26th of May, 2018. 20 years ago, in May of 1998, and I believe it was May 11th, 1998, when India, under the government of Atal Bihari Vajpayee at the time, it decided to conduct nuclear tests. Sort of say after prior to that, it was in 1974 that India had conducted what it, at that time, in 74, called the peaceful nuclear explosions. But at least, again, in 1998, there was no pretense for those tests to be even termed as peaceful nuclear explosions. And that was an act described, if I'm paraphrasing her right, described by Arundhati Roy as India's attempt to gate crash the nuclear club. And in India, at least the popular or the dominant theme at that time was that the nuclear tests are going to ensure India a spot among the great powers of the world. Pakistan, which had always viewed India as the enemy number one, decided to follow the suit, and on May 28th, which is kind of basically a day and a half from today, on May 28th, Pakistan followed with its own set of nuclear explosions, thus putting South Asia firmly on the overt nuclear path. 20 years down that nuclear path, India and Pakistan are still the same old enemies. They bicker, they fight, and the situation within those countries for many segments of the society maybe is not better than it was 20 years ago. So to mark this 20th anniversary of nuclear explosions in South Asia, at least I'm really delighted, and so will be you, that we have 4 excellent individuals who really have spent so much of their time, effort, and in understanding not only nuclear weapons in South Asia, but how the nuclear issue, or the nuclear weapons kind of issue is connected with other things like democracy, secularism, and nationalism in these countries. So SANSAD, which stands for South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, our local organization, which is your host today, honestly, SANSAD simply couldn't have managed to invite on its own and manage to have these panelists here. And for that, we are really, really grateful to the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC, and especially Professor Rammanohar, because all these gentlemen are here. Basically, they came here to attend a workshop that Rammanohar had organized at UBC to kind of assess South Asia after 20 years of nuclearization. So thank you, Rammanohar, for that. And also, today's event is co-sponsored by the Institute of Humanities at SFU, as well as South Asian Film Education Society and the Committee of Progressive Pakistani Canadians. So that is a bit by way of introduction. So before I just briefly introduce our panelists today, the format will be that we want to really kind of say, instead of having, because all four panelists, they were kind enough and they agreed that instead of having kind of the long monologues, that they'll be very, very well qualified to give, and still we will be sort of really kind of be thankful to them for that. But they decided that they are going to go with a short 10 minutes type of comments, and so that we can use maximum amount of time to have conversation about these issues. So our panelists, for those of us who are students of South Asian security issues or South Asian politics, really these speakers do not need any introduction. But those of us, or those of you who may not be following South Asian, say, the academic scene that closely, here is a little bit about these individuals. On my immediate left is Zia Mian, and Zia is a physicist by training, an activist and coordinator of Princeton University's program on science and global security. And his research and teaching focuses on nuclear weapons and nuclear energy policy. He is the co-chair of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, which is a group of independent experts from 18 countries working to reduce global stockpiles of nuclear weapons usable materials. And Zia has worked in Pakistan as well as the United States, and has been kind of you could say the part and parcel of the peace movement of South Asia. And then is Dr. H. Nayyar, again a physicist. I wish, say, in Pakistan there were more even social scientists who did the kind of wonderful job that you guys do. But so Nayyar Saab is also a physicist, and who taught not only physics, maybe taught physics in classrooms in Haider University, but that's my alma mater, and on what we used to call khokhas. And maybe in India, those are called the dhabas, but those informal kind of classrooms that he held on those khokhas, whatever kind of say the people like me have learned a bit about South Asia. Credit goes to people like Nayyar Saab. He has a PhD from Imperial College London, and he is. He's president of Pakistan Peace Coalition and was founding member of the Asian Peace Alliance. And then we have Dr. Rammanohar Reddy. He has PhD in economics, but he decided to kind of say leave those ivory towers and work more as a journalist. And in that, he was earlier editor of the famous EPW, or the Economic and Political Weekly. I'm sure all students of South Asian politics of South Asia know that EPW is the only weekly refereed magazine or journal probably anywhere in the world. So, and besides that, Dr. Rammanohar Reddy has co-authored a book with Ramana, Prisoners of the Nuclear Dream. So again, really kind of say glad to have him amongst us, and then Professor Achin Vanaik. He's I think retired, maybe not the. Probably, I mean, like I said, the word does not kind of say your contributions and the word retired don't go together. But Professor Vanaik has kind of say been teaching at Political Science Department of Delhi University. But he has been writing say books, research articles, journalistic pieces, and so public intellectual par excellence. And for many years, again, say the students of South Asian or modern South Asia, we always kind of thought in terms of duo of Achin Vanaik and Praful Bidwai. So kind of sort of a personal loss that we don't have Professor Bidwai amongst us anymore. But so really honored to have you amongst us. First, Mian, he's going to talk about nuclear dangers in South Asia, followed by Nayyar Saab, who is going to talk about building peace under nuclear shadow. And then Rammanohar Reddy will talk about crisis of democracy and the assault on the media. And then Achin Vanaik on nationalism, democracy, and internationalism. Thank you very much. Over to you, Zia.
Thank you, Haider. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. So to carry out the task assigned to me, which was to talk about just the nuclear danger part of the South Asian situation today, marking the 20 years since the nuclear tests. I want to talk about our understanding of the current situation in terms of the nature and scale of the danger and some of the things that can go wrong, and then talk about some of the things that are driving this process at present and may be expected to continue to drive them in the future, absent changes which can be brought about by peace movements and other external forces, and then to hand the conversation over for people to put the kind of political analysis and the social analysis and the other contexts into play. So, as Haider mentioned, and as many of you know, it's now 20 years since the last round of nuclear weapons tests. And many of us at that time thought that it was fairly inevitable that both countries would now pursue open programs of the development and deployment of nuclear weapon systems. And that's been pretty much what has happened. Under international pressure and because of the existence of the Comprehensive Nuclear Weapons Test Ban Treaty, which had been signed just before the nuclear tests by most countries in the world, after the nuclear tests of 1998, neither India or Pakistan have carried out any further nuclear weapon tests. And that in itself is actually a significant achievement of the international system, to be able to limit the number of nuclear weapons tests and what that means in terms of the diversity and scale of nuclear weapons that India and Pakistan have been able to develop. It's not clear that that is something that will persist indefinitely. it is possible to imagine, future rounds of nuclear tests. But in terms of what Pakistan and India have been able to do with their nuclear weapons, the most informed independent estimates currently are that India and Pakistan both now have more than 100 nuclear weapons available to them to use. With Pakistan perhaps having a few more, but it's comparable numbers, but in excess of 100. And the scale of those arsenals increases every year. There's no policy statement and no reason to assume that either country has decided to limit itself to the arsenal that it has today, but that the expansion will continue. And at the rate at which they're expanding, Pakistan's arsenal of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials from which to build nuclear weapons is actually growing at present faster than in the case of India. Pakistan has spent a lot of money building new facilities for making nuclear weapons materials. And so it's expected that in a decade or so, Pakistan may well have a nuclear arsenal comparable in number to that held by Britain or France or China. And India could achieve an arsenal of similar size. It could theoretically build even bigger arsenal if it wished to do so in future. They also have a large number of different kinds of missiles with which to deliver those weapons. They're very short-range missiles, of the order of some tens of kilometers for use on the battlefield. And there are all the way up to very long-range missiles with ranges of several thousand kilometers. And both India and Pakistan claim now to have the capability to launch missiles which carry more than one nuclear weapon, multiple warheads on one missile. And so they're following a pretty predictable track of the kinds of capabilities that were built by the previous nuclear weapon states. They've also followed a path similar to that of the United States and the others in having nuclear weapons to be dropped from airplanes, nuclear weapons on missiles at land, and nuclear weapons that will go on missiles to be fired from the sea, whether it's submarines or ships, but from the sea. So this is all fairly typical of previous nuclear weapon states. The British, the Chinese, the French, the United States and the Soviet Union all did the same kind of thing. But what's worth keeping in mind is that because of the limited number of nuclear weapon tests and the speed with which those arsenals have grown and the diversity of nuclear weapons to go with these different kinds of systems that they have, there is a reasonable concern about the risk of nuclear weapon accidents in both countries. And to just illustrate that in one anecdote, think about the simple fact that the United States was the first country to make nuclear weapons and use nuclear weapons in 1945 with help from Canada. And 40 years later, after having done almost 1,000 tests of nuclear weapons, the Americans discovered that their new nuclear weapons that they had sent to Europe for use against the Soviet Union in the early 1980s had a potentially disastrous design flaw. These were nuclear artillery shells to be fired from cannon on the battlefield. And they discovered that there was a danger that if one of these weapons actually fell off the back of a truck, it might explode. And this is after 40 years of designing and building nuclear weapons, they realized that, oops, we hadn't considered that possibility. And so all these weapons had to be withdrawn and new adaptations made to them to stop this kind of accidental possibility. And so the fact that India and Pakistan are making different kinds of nuclear weapons for different kinds of systems, the possibility of accidental detonation of nuclear weapons, never mind wars, is a concern that grows with time. I'm not going to talk about the risk of terrorists stealing nuclear weapons. I mean, that's true for everybody in all kinds of circumstances, and maybe higher for Pakistan than for others in recent years, but it may not be an enduring feature of the system, whereas accidents are something that happen regardless of immediate political context. The other thing that I want to highlight is that we've discovered one genuinely new fact from the scientific point of view, and that is that before 1998 and in the previous history of nuclear weapons, people had not understood the way that we do now, that even the use of a small number of nuclear weapons against cities could actually trigger nuclear winter. We had previously imagined that only a large-scale nuclear war using thousands of nuclear weapons, which was something only the United States and Soviet Union would do, would trigger enough smoke and soot into the atmosphere to darken the sky so that sunlight wouldn't reach the ground and cause catastrophic destruction of agriculture and ecosystems. It turns out now, using modern climate models, the computer models that we use to understand climate change, that even as few as the use of 50 nuclear weapons each against cities, and the models have all been run for Pakistan and India. So if they used half the nuclear weapons they have now against each other, and the targets were cities, enough smoke and soot would be produced from burning trees, houses, buildings, factories, people, that you would darken the sky and cause a catastrophic collapse of most agriculture and ecosystems over most of the northern hemisphere and large parts of the southern hemisphere that would last for more than 2 decades and cause catastrophic collapse of civilization as we know it. This is a genuinely new scientific fact that no one had anticipated before, and that's come out over the last decade or so. The last thing I want to point out is, in terms of looking forward, the drivers that are worth keeping in mind apart from the politics is that both countries have put in place, as all nuclear weapon states have done before, military units, scientific units, and ideological structures to justify, maintain, modernize, and drive forward their nuclear weapons. So there is a constant bureaucratic pressure to keep these nuclear weapons and to keep budgets and careers on path. And so any effort to undo them has to deal not just with abstractions of strategy and policy, but the fact that there are institutions and people whose careers and futures and rely on this kind of thing. The other thing is that nuclear weapons have become part of the standard war-fighting imagination on both sides, both in terms of policymakers. They're used to threatening the use of nuclear weapons now in crisis. And soldiers are preparing and planning and have made arrangements for the use of nuclear weapons in war. So if we do get to a war, it's hard to imagine them stopping short, given how much time and effort they put into thinking about exactly how they're going to do with this. And the last complication that's worth keeping in mind is that, unlike the United States and the Soviet Union, which is often the model that comes to mind with people when it comes to nuclear war between two countries with nuclear weapons, in the case of India and Pakistan, absolutely there is a history of war between these two countries. But there are outside factors and outside powers who are increasingly invested in these countries and their futures. So what was once an important US-Pakistan relationship has now been replaced by a very, very important Pakistan-China relationship. And what was once a fairly ambivalent US-India relationship has been replaced by a deeply militarized and economically interdependent US-India relationship, in part directed to contain the rise of China. So what we now see is that two of the most important powers in the world are actually connected to both India and Pakistan in complicated ways, including military planning and military alliance structures. And so it is hard to see a situation in which future crises between Pakistan and India will not drag in the United States and China, and they will bring their own hostilities, animosities, and complications of the great power relationship into the South Asian setting and make any kind of crisis management that much more difficult. So thinking about the fact that we have now 4 states with nuclear weapons actually vested in what's going on in South Asia rather than just 2. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. The point that I have been asked to talk about over here is how is peace building done in the nuclear weapons scenario in India and Pakistan in South Asia. Peace building under the nuclear shadow. Let me start by reminding ourselves that peace movement and anti-nuclear peace activism had existed before the overt nuclearization of 1998. So I'm reminded of various things. There have been academics warning in the peoples of India and Pakistan of the dangers of nuclear weapons way back in the 1980s. The first sign of this, to my knowledge, came from the scientists working in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, preparing a nice presentation on the disasters that follow use of nuclear weapons, and with the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this was brought to Pakistan by some scientists visiting TIFR at that time. So in TIFR, actually, there were some nice activists who now are actually quite prominent in Indian sciences. One was Spanta Vadia, and the other one was Ram Ramaswamy. These were the people who were at TIFR and who had actually prepared that nice presentation. In Pakistan, the first ever event to mark the 40th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in 1985, again done by scientists like Mian and Parvez Bhai and other people working in Quaid-e-Azam University, and tried to inform the public that nuclear weapons are not to be taken very lightly. And simultaneously, in Pakistan, a movement called Movement for Nuclear Disarmament was launched. This was a brief attempt, in the sense that at that time, nobody was sure that Pakistan had nuclear weapons. There was a deniability associated with our nuclear program. So there wasn't much interest in public that one could generate, and hence this movement didn't last very long. This was the first ever attempt at making anti-nuclear peace movement in Pakistan. Before the nuclear shadows started to fall on us. Other than that, there have been other peace movements. There was this Pakistan-India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy, which was made by some intellectuals of India and Pakistan who thought that bringing people together and creating an interaction between people, intellectuals, workers, political workers, and so on, would reduce tensions between India and Pakistan. And this forum continued to work for quite a while. So this was the status of peace movement before the overt nuclearization of 1998. In 1998, when the nuclear tests were conducted, there was lots of cries of jingoism on the two sides. There were very strong statements coming in from some Indian leadership, and there is a strong rebuttals coming from Pakistan leadership. And there was a kind of fear prevailed over there at that time in that environment. And soon after that, although new peace movements erupted in Pakistan and India, new peace movements that had not existed before that, there were city-based peace movements which came up in Pakistan. The one in Islamabad was called Citizens' Peace Movement. The one in Karachi was called Action Committee Against Arms Race. The one in Lahore was called Joint Action Committee for People's Rights, and so on. And they were all, they immediately raised their disapproval of nuclearization of South Asia. All of these movements actually were then gathered together under a coalition of these organizations, and this coalition was called Pakistan Peace Coalition. And this Pakistan Peace Coalition, which came into being in 1999, had a corresponding counterpart in India, which was called Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace in India. And both of these organizations became sister organizations and worked together, held various conferences together and conventions together, and tried to raise awareness against nuclear weapons in South Asia and tried to inform people. However, soon thereafter, India and Pakistan sort of entangled themselves in a series of crises, a series of events that made the situation between India and Pakistan very dangerous. So soon thereafter there was this Kargil war, which was in summer of 1999. There was a hijacking of Indian plane in the December of 1999. There was attack on Indian Parliament in December 2001, and then deployment of the forces of India and Pakistan for 14 months. Thereafter, there were bombings in India at various places like Samjhota Express, like Mumbai, like Pathankot, like Uri, and so on and so forth. And so all of these things raised tensions tremendously and made people very suspicious of each other, and in fact strengthened the hands of all the war-loving people, war-mongering people in India and Pakistan. On the military side, Zia described how various developments took place, but on the other hand, there were more fear-creating news coming in the form of, say, the Cold Start Doctrine of India, and the corresponding, and after that, the battlefield nuclear weapons made by Pakistan, and so on. All of these things acted as barriers to the people-to-people contacts between India and Pakistan. So before that, there were a larger people-to-people contact between India and Pakistan, and this got reduced tremendously because both the countries started to see these things with suspicion, and things became very difficult to be promoted in the peace, to be promoted in South Asia. The state, at least in Pakistan, I do not know about India. In Pakistan, the state did not respond so well to the peace movement. It was very harsh on the peace movements in some ways. It attacked them in the press in a kind of campaign kind of manner. It attacked peace movements in the press, maligned them and intimidated them. There was a book that Zia compiled in 1992 or 93, and Zia had made that. That book was actually was initially ISI attempted to stop the printing of that book, but finally somebody printed that book. But that publisher was later on very greatly harassed, and it says really arrested and tortured and all of that. So the state actually tried to dissuade people from anything that could promote peace. And after that, in Pakistan, situation became a little different in the sense that internal strifes started as a result of the Afghan war, and after that, the jihadis, the Taliban, and those forces. And these new dangers diverted the attention of the people who were peace activists. In fact, in the society, there is only a small subset of people who are the ones who are worried about peace, and who are also worried about human rights, and who are also worried about people's rights and so on. So as soon as things worsen from one in one direction, their attention gets diverted to that. So at the moment, the attention of all those people is towards the grave violation of human rights in Pakistan nowadays, where people are being abducted by security forces and kept out, and enforced disappearances, as they are called, and then tortured, and and bodies, murdered bodies thrown out on roads, and so on and so forth. All of those things are, and of course, attacks, murderous attacks on people in various places. These things are going on at the moment, and these have attracted the attention of these people, and so the peace movement, anti-nuclear peace movement, is not terribly active at this time. Even to the extent that the ban the bomb treaty, which is a very big event, that should have been such that people should have been happy about it, or at least there should have been a debate on it within the country. That did not take place at all. People just were, their attention could not be taken into that direction. So for the moment, things are that anti-nuclear peace movement is very quiet and cold at the moment because of many other events in the society. However, I think those people, we continue to hope that the situation between India and Pakistan will not get worse, and that we will get a time to inform people of the dangers that lurk in the form of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Over to you, Fred.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the state of India's media today, to talk about what has happened to the media and why, for example, it doesn't give much attention to nuclear weapons, or for that matter, give news about the nuclear weapons ban treaty, why it neglects such things. Now, the media today in India is a bit of a strange animal. It is one of the most thriving media sectors in the world. For example, the biggest English newspaper in India, the Times of India, sells more than any other English newspaper in the world, or at least so it claims. About 12 million copies a day. But again, it is not even one of the 10 biggest newspapers in India. There are newspapers in Hindi, in Malayalam, Bengali, which sell many more copies. And TV channels, I don't know if you'd be surprised that there are more than 850 TV channels in India, out of which about 300 are 24/7 news channels in different languages. And many of these media companies are extremely profitable. Not all of them, I mean the smaller ones sometimes struggle, but the bigger ones are extremely profitable, and they wield an enormous amount of influence. But this is when looking at it in narrow terms, in terms of numbers, reach, circulation, viewership, or finances. As far as the functioning of the media as an important institution in a democracy, the story, unfortunately, is a rather dismal one. Of course, there are nuances, there are differences, I'll give some examples later. Some institutions do take their job seriously, especially the smaller ones, especially the ones in state capitals, etc. But the larger institutions, the more influential media companies, whether in print or on TV, are not, over the past 20 years, they have become much weaker. Now, there are three sets of reasons for this. One is government, especially the current government, but not the only one. Previous government also did this, but this present government has perfected the art. It has leaned much more easily and much more heavily on media companies. Whenever it doesn't like bad news, it doesn't like critical news, it likes to micromanage the media. And the media companies are willing to bend when pressure is applied to them. The situation today compares with what the situation was during the emergency, when fundamental rights were suspended, and more famously it is said that the media companies at that time were asked to bend, and yet they crawled. Something of that kind has been happening over the past few years. The second reason why it has weakened as far as performing its role as an independent critical institution in democracy is that it has been targeted by the BJP and Bharatiya Janata Party and other right-wing organizations, questioning its legitimacy, because they recognized early on that this was an important institution which was not always friendly to them. So over the past 10, 20 years, they've perfected it again the past 5 years. They've attacked it systematically as saying that it's the mouthpiece of the elite, it's the mouthpiece of the Congress party, it's the mouthpiece of so-called pseudo-secularism, and forms of abuse have been hurled by ministers with union cabinet calling journalists prostitutes. You could see what the play is on. The third reason, and that's what I'd like to spend some time on, is worrying, is that there is a weakening from within. It's not just the external pressures that have weakened the media, but there's a weakening from within. And here I just like to give you a bit of news over the past 2 days. There has been a report of a major undercover media investigation by a small investigating media company called Cobra Post. Okay. What they did was they sent an undercover reporter posing as a representative of the right-wing organization, unnamed, claiming that he had connections all over the country and that he was based abroad and that he had a huge advertising budget with him. Now his brief, and this is what is surprising, he was able to have access to the top level presidents and managing directors of 20 of India's biggest print and TV companies, telling them that he would like to spend as much as $50 to $75 million on advertising over the past year, building up to the elections next year, to project a Hindu point of view, not just project a Hindu point of view, to attack opponents and to create a certain polarization in the media through reports. Now, what are these reports? These reports are something unique to India. They're called advertorials. Those are advertisements passing off as news reports. The advertiser gives money and the newspaper staff writes it up, and it is published in the similar typeface as a news report, but somewhere in the corner it will be said, this is an advertorial. Okay? Now, this undercover reporter, as I said, met the senior executives of 20 companies, including that of the Times of India, and promised $100 million budget over the next year. Now, the surprising thing is that something like this, any self-respecting media company would have immediately asked that person to get out. Okay? But he was heard, he was promised support, etc. Now, this is illustrative of what one commentator has called that cash is king. Okay? For the Indian media sector, what matters now is revenue and profit. The main role of the media of acting as an independent, critical institution in India's democracy has been slowly pushed to the side. It's not that it's completely absent. Obviously, it gets its legitimacy from claiming to be an independent institution, but over time, that has become secondary. And part of this process is that journalists and editors have been sidelined. Managements, advertising executives, they have become more important because newspapers and TV channels are now seen as consumer products, okay, which must be sold in the largest numbers to generate the largest amount of revenue and a high profitability. Now, what has been the editorial impact of this process? Now, I just want to, this process has been going on for about 20 years. I don't want to say it's happened only in the past 4 or 5 years under the BJP government. No, it has been going on for the past 20 years and dates to the introduction of neoliberal policies in India when the economy got transformed. But it has accelerated in the past few years. The result of all this is that because importance is given to the bottom line more than anything else, media, whether on TV or on print, they are far less critical than they should be. They have a tendency to take government handouts for what they are. They are unwilling to question, and they're very easily willing to shut up when some pressure is put on them. Now, this is the overall picture, and you shouldn't be surprised, therefore, that as far as nuclear weapons are concerned, over the years they become more and more silent. Not that they're ever critical, but even the limited amount of space that we used to be given earlier, that has largely disappeared. They're not critical, and one of the tragedies of the past year is when that important United Nations treaty was signed, there was very, very little coverage in the Indian press, whether on TV or on print. Second, when the organization was given the Nobel Prize, again, there was just a little bit of news coverage, almost no editorial comment. Now, this reflects the Indian state's, the government's view that that was not a treaty that they were really very positive about, and therefore the press has picked it up. Now, in this kind of situation, what has happened is that this thriving media sector, financially thriving media sector, its legitimacy has been questioned, is being undermined, and the parallel process is that very dangerous tendency is the spread of what is called the WhatsAppization of news in India. Okay, the use of WhatsApp. See, in North America and Europe, you talk about Facebook and Twitter as the agency for spreading fake news. In India, it's not. It's WhatsApp, okay? Because on inexpensive smartphones, you can spread rumors and they spread like wildfire. You can't trace them. So increasingly, people are turning to and depending on WhatsApp for the kind of news that they get, and that has become a source of incendiary news, and has been, in more than one instance, has led to extreme acts of violence. Now, this is the overall situation. I just want to, before concluding, I just want to say that while presenting a dismal picture, I also want to say that there are units and people in the media who have continued to take their job seriously and give their lives for it. Many of you may not have heard, last year, a journalist of 20-30 years, her name was Gauri Lankesh, in Bangalore, she was shot dead. The killers have not been arrested, but she was known for systematically standing up to the authorities and standing up to the Hindutva right-wing forces, being extremely critical. And it is believed that she has been shot for that. Similarly, in many small towns, small reporters in small publications, etc., are routinely harassed by the state for highlighting either police excesses or corruption, and yet they continue to do their job in spite of these kind of pressures. But sadly, these are becoming more and more the exceptions, because the force of money, if you can use that word, is been acting on the media, and it's becoming less and less an independent institution in a democracy, and more an economic activity like any other. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me start with an apology on two counts. One is that although nuclear weapons have been a constant preoccupation of mine, I won't be dealing with that. I'll be talking about nationalism, democracy, and internationalism. And secondly, my presentation is going to be somewhat conceptual and general. But I would be happy, and therefore a series of assertions in many cases, but which I would be happy to defend their plausibility if you question it or you wish me to say more about that. Let me start then with the question of nationalism. Let me take three terms: nation, nation-state, nationalism. Those who have thought seriously about it recognize that when you talk about the nation-state, and when you talk about nationalism, where nationalism, of course, can be understood as doctrine or ideology, it can be understood as movement, it can be understood as sentiment or identity, that when you talk about nationalism and the nation-state, you're talking about modern phenomena. They belong to modernity. There is a dispute about the question of the nation. Is it old or new? And the large majority, and I subscribe to that view, say it is modern. But there are those who make very interesting and serious points who say that no, it is something that is old. Now, we all know that nations and nationalisms invent some kind of a past for themselves. They invent traditions. And although there are a number of nations that we would say are very new, aren't there some that can claim legitimately to be old? And isn't that oldness due to some fundamental cultural characteristics and so on? And here, of course, there is then a divide. Those who are modernists will say, obviously, there is a cultural as well as political dimension to nationalism, but what makes the nation, not just nationalism or the nation state, but what makes the nation modern is the political dimension, which, important as the cultural dimension is in order to understand its appeal, its emotional character, and so on, nonetheless, it's the political dimension that's most important. And what they have in mind when they say this is they say that whenever you talk about the nation or nationalism, you have to recognize that this is connected to some idea of creating or establishing political control over some territorial space. And the form of political control can be of three types: autonomy within a larger framework, independence, or even separation and merger with some other state. So that political dimension is there are other aspects of the political dimension I won't go into. But yes, there is a cultural dimension, but if you like, those who are primordialists, those who talk about it being something that's old, see the modern nation, in many cases, not all, as evolving. And the others, the modernists, say, no, not evolving, it's constructed. Yes, there are ingredients of the past which reflect specific histories, but it's constructed. And you will only find one thing that is common to all nationalisms and all nations. And that one thing is not any fixed objective attribute. It's not language, it's not religion, it's not your common history. You can have countries which have parts of a country which have very different history. It's not territory, Hawaii, there's that here, Bangladesh, East and West Pakistan sometime and so on. Then what is it? It's the fact that at some particular point of time, you have a people who come to believe that they belong together. And there are different communities of belonging, but the nation is a particular kind of belonging. It's a belonging that has a political strut. It's a kind of state of mind that strives to become a political fact. The best single definition that I could find this thing is in my words. It came from Hans Kohn, but to put it in my words, it would go something like this. If you want to understand the nation, it is a cultural entity lodged above all in consciousness, striving to become a political fact. You have to connect the cultural dimension, which above all is most important in terms of how it relates to creating that, and then, of course, the political dimension. Okay, so loosely, let's say that there are two ways of understanding the nation and nationalism. One, it's an inheritance It belongs to the past. This, if you like, is how the Chinese would say it. This is how the Indians would say it, and so on. It belongs to the past, an inheritance from the past. Now, if you understand nationalism as an inheritance from the past, there will always be disputes about what is the proper inheritance and who are the proper inheritors. In India, the proper inheritance is Hinduism. No, Nehru and others. No, it's composite character. You feel, right? And as far as who are the proper inheritors, you Muslims are not the proper inheritor in the Indian context. That's one way of looking at it. The second way is to recognize that nation and nationalism belongs to the present and the future, and that it is what we are going to make it. It's something that's motile. It's something that actually develops and constructs and is challenged. And here, the strength of a particular nation, even its movement towards some kind of a democratic character, will be intimately related to how open and inclusive it is. If you like, if it belongs to the present and the future, right, then, and it's so diverse. A country like India is the most diverse, but not just India. There's a migration, you've got Canada, you've got the United States, you've got all these countries and so on. Yeah? Then, is it a country stronger, a nation stronger, if it has an essentialist character, which you must recognize? And if you don't recognize it, you're weakening us. Or is a nation state stronger because there are different ways of being and feeling, being part of that country? In other words, if there are different ways of being and feeling Indian, if there are different ways of being and feeling Canadian or American or whatever. I believe in the second, but that can only emerge, right, if there is in that society a respect for the different cultures, the languages, and not just their culture and languages, but their fundamental secular needs in a variety of cases and so on here. So these are, if you like, two ways of understanding it. The Hindu nationalist version, and not just the Hindu nationalist version, you'll find it elsewhere, and incidentally, civic nationalisms have their own problems. For all the grand talk that the Americans and the French do, there are also problems with the civic, but they're obviously better than ethnic forms of nationalism. The Hindutva crowd has what I would call a sleeping beauty concept of nationhood. Let me try and explain that. You all know the story of Sleeping Beauty, right? In the Indian context, the fundamental beauty of India lies in its essential Hinduness. This is the great beauty of India, right? And just like Sleeping Beauty was slumbering for so long, it was awakened by the kiss of Prince Charming. And in the Indian context, this essential Hinduness of India must be awakened by the kiss of India's Prince Charming, of course, the forces of Hindutva, which are going to give it the kiss of its politics. And just as Sleeping Beauty was put to sleep by some evil witch, the same thing happened in India. And who is it that put our beauty to sleep, if you like, for so long? Was it the Mughals? Was it the Persians? Was it the Turks? Was it the Afghans? No. It was Muslims. Because when you say Muslims, you can unite all of them, and you can also make the Muslims in India complicit with this. So in a sense, this is something that exists here. You have to recognize it. So having said this, clearly we need to move towards more open, inclusive, more democratic forms of nationalism. But let's also recognize that all nationalisms, even as they are universal and particular, even as they are inclusive and exclusive, even the most inclusive and more democratic forms of nationalism have their limits and dangers. When you're dealing with something like nationalism, I think it's very important that even as one strives for more progressive forms of nationalism, I think we should be very clear. There are limits to how progressive nationalism can be. There are no limits to how reactionary it can be. And the question that is facing us on a global scale in many ways today has been the rise of right-wing populisms. Their frequency and their scale is much greater than the few left-wing populisms that exist over here. And they're often called authoritarian populisms. Now, please note the word populism. Populism is a reference to the concept of people, right? Right? The second thing is that all these authoritarian right-wing populisms, please notice, are actually forms of authoritarian nationalism, which suggests that, in fact, why are they nationalist? It suggests, in fact, and this can be taken up later, the enormous power of nationalism as a community of belonging, I would say far stronger than even religion as a community of belonging and so on. And the populism, the people. So what is actually being saying for the authoritarian nationalism? They're saying, and they're stressing the importance of people constituted as separate nations. So even as we strive to make it more democratic, let's recognize that this is a very real danger. And there's a very real danger in our present context because we have to go beyond it to address certain problems. And historically speaking, when we talk about internationalism, which really begins to emerge at the beginning of the 19th century, from the beginning of the 19th century to about the end of the third quarter of the 20th century, the banner of internationalism was upheld by the forces of the left. You know, when you talked about the 19th century, the international perspective, socialism, the working class, sisterhood, the equality of men and women, the struggle for the suffragette movement, which had the backing of all kinds of left forces. After that, the struggle against imperialism and colonialism, the left again. But from the beginning of the fourth quarter of the 20th century till now, the banner of internationalism has been upheld by the right. Globalizing capitalism, neoliberal globalization in a certain sense. But the interesting thing about this globalization of this internationalism is that it cannot do without nationalism and the nation state. For all the talk that has been put forward over the last so many years by leftists, by liberals, and by rightists, that with this expanding capitalist globalization, the nation state is going to become less and less important, it hasn't happened. In fact, the perspective for the future, unless we're going to have some very dramatic change, is you're going to have a continuation of globalizing capitalism and the continuation of a system of nation states. Once again, it's a kind of testimony to the power and significance of the nation state. But I would simply say that we once again have to move towards a kind of internationalism to tackle what I would call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. One, and they are new developments. One, for the first time in human history, when there is no global scarcity of resources, we have immense suffering. Pre-capitalist societies had economic crises, which are basically the crisis of underproduction. Capitalism is unique because you have a crisis of overproduction. On a global scale, there is no need for us to, for anybody not to have basic needs. And today's basic needs don't just include nutrition, it includes leisure, health, education, and for people who are getting older like me, social security, all of that, right? But today, 1.6 billion people are malnourished and undernourished. Inequalities of income and wealth are huge, which of course undermines notions of democracy. And what has happened in the last 20 years or so is that democracy has been like butter. It spreads, but as it spreads, it thins. So procedural democracy has spread to Africa and elsewhere, but everywhere, including the advanced democracies, including in Canada and all these places here, it's thinned. So you have this kind of situation, and the reality is that this is going to continue. This is not going to change. That's one. Second, the ecological dimension. And I would connect capitalism to the first horseman of the apocalypse, and I will connect capitalism to the second horseman of the apocalypse, which is the question of ecological devastation. Capitalism's strength and its weakness has always been the competitive dimension. But capitalism's pursuit of profit necessarily implies that there has to be a pursuit of constant growth, endless growth. And in fact, Kenneth Boulding, in the 1950s, one of the economists who was much more ecologically sensitive, pointed out quite correctly. He said that to believe that you can have unlimited growth in a finite world, question of physics, of energy, and so on, you have to be either a fool or an economist. And he's absolutely right, because conventional economics does not have any serious theory because of its belief in the substitutability of all factors. It has no serious theory of limits. Other problems, but let's leave that aside. The third horseman of the apocalypse, if you like, is the question of the politics of cultural exclusivism, which have emerged from the beginning of the fourth quarter of the 20th century, which have taken basically three forms: the form of ethnicity, the religion, and nationalism, and where they've combined, nationalism has been more important. So everything is broken on the shoals of nationalism. The socialist left, the international working class, the workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And the reality today is the upper classes and the upper middle classes of the world unite. You have nothing to lose, certainly not your privileges. That's true. I mean, this is the kind of situation that we have now here. And religion is not as powerful as nationalism. That's why most religions seek to co-opt nationalism. Again, one can discuss that. But attempts to go beyond it, ISIL, etc., don't really work. The fourth apocalypse, if you like, is the question of nuclear weapons. For the first time in human history, we're in a situation where a large part of the world and, if not all, of the human species is threatened by this. So more than ever do we need to go beyond the limits of even a progressive nationalism, utilizing progressive nationalism as a mediation, as a halfway station towards moving towards a deeper and greater internationalism. And this may sound very trite to you, and I'll end with this, is just as I blame capitalism for the first two horsemen of the apocalypse, it's also indirectly connected to the third and indirectly connected to the last, which may not seem to be the case because everybody talks about the dangers of nuclear nationalism, which is absolutely correct. But I would suggest to you that, in fact, the existence of a multiple system of nation states and the difficulties in going beyond it is actually connected to the functionality of the nation state system for capitalism. And that's, of course, something that can be disputed, but if by me you believe that, then that means that we have to think in terms of that very old perspective which is dismissed as utopian or dystopian, and that is that you have to think about going beyond capitalism towards striving for a better world. I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just kind of say what I'm going to do is basically abuse this moderator's chair that I have or occupying. So maybe I'll just kind of say throw one question at each of our panelists, and then we will kind of say open the floor for conversation. Now, of course, I mean, like I said, in a way, what Professor Achin Vanaik said, or disclaimer that he gave that he's not going to talk about nuclear weapons and just about nation or the nation state. I think if all of us, when we heard all four speakers, all these themes, they are very much interconnected, right? So kind of, I mean, like say, if you're talking about the peace movement in India and Pakistan, well, what they are up against is that dominant discourse or notions of nationalism and what the national interests are and so forth. So I'll just individually, I mean, like I said, maybe answer individually and then we'll open the floor. Starting with very kind of more mundane type of nuts and bolts type of question to Zia, because you spoke about what India and Pakistan after the overt nuclearization, what they have achieved or not achieved and what they have learned or unlearned. On that count, as you rightly said, that India and Pakistan amongst themselves, they may be the kind of, say, probably the third largest possessors of nuclear weapons, right, after, say, the Americans and Russians, right? So, and what we had been told before this and even after this, after the 1998 test, was that these nuclear weapons, they are going to bring some kind of strategic balance or deter India and Pakistan from going into a full-scale war. Right? That's was at least the kind of the issue or the mantra in Pakistan. Now, as you kind of rightly pointed out, that the dangers of any crisis or any war between India and Pakistan escalating into nuclear is very imminent, right? It's not far-flung possibility, and given number of crises that have happened, say after 1998, be it Kargil or be it say 2002, or even whatever we hear from say periodically from Indian and Pakistani military and civilian leadership. So in that sense, do you think that the Pakistani and Indian, those analysts or those policymakers who really have their hands on nuclear weapons, have they made kind of say these assessments and saying that, well, in case of war, it'll be okay to kind of decimate each other's few million people or few metropolises? So what is it kind of say? What can you tell us about those guys who really are managing and manufacturing and probably kind of say contemplating use of these nuclear weapons in that region?
That's a question you should ask them. And it's probably not a question they ask themselves either, so they may not even be able to give you an answer. What we can say reasonably is that what history teaches us about people who are responsible for making decisions about nuclear weapons in countries that have had nuclear weapons for far longer than Pakistan and India is that time doesn't necessarily help prevent crisis. The last really severe crisis that took place that we know of between the United States and the Soviet Union was in the early 1980s, by which, they've had nuclear weapons for well over 30 years. And they've had thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons and many previous crises. Right? I mean, they've had the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s, they've had Berlin, they've had this, that. Many crises in the early years, and then crisis frequency diminishes. But in 1983, they had a really severe crisis. It was a real war scare with the prospect of the use of nuclear weapons. So all that time hadn't prepared them for anticipating a crisis or the severity of the crisis. So, crisis will continue to happen. The second part of it is that when you think about the Indian and the Pakistani side and how they think about devastating cities, etc., I'll just tell you by analogy. Vladimir Putin was recently asked about Russian thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. That, if nuclear war starts and the United States attacks first, what's the point of Russia retaliating with its thousands of nuclear weapons? And he said, if there is no Russia, why should we care what happens to the world? Right? And this is from somebody who's been in charge of the Russian nuclear arsenal, not once, but more than once. And generations of people in Russia have had responsibility for thinking about nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, you have Donald Trump, who makes the observation that why do we have them if we can't use them? Okay? And so, and he brags, as in his most recent letter, stopping the planning for the nuclear summit with North Korea, that my nuclear weapons are massive and dangerous in comparison to yours. So this idea of nuclear weapons as power, as symbol, as status, and the fact that it's tied to the nation state, that, if it comes to nuclear war, you can decimate my cities and I will bring the world down because I don't care anymore. That without my nation state, I don't care about anything anymore. So in that sense, there's no reason to presume that the people in Pakistan and India who thought nuclear weapons were a good idea in the first place will think any differently from other people who thought nuclear weapons were a good idea. You know, so one can expect them to behave in analogous ways.
And Nayyar, I mean, like I said, you gave us kind of the overview or synopsis of peace movements in India and Pakistan, and from based on that synopsis, what I gather is that at least on say the Pakistani side, because peace movement or people associated with peace movement, because they have to, take up many other pressing issues, and when some things like kind of forced disappearances and gross violation of human rights and so forth, so of course they take up their priority, but given this almost kind of a lifelong association with peace movement and the challenges, because I must kind of say that in 1998 or so, when India and Pakistan went nuclear, anyone who dared to even question the logic of those tests, of course, I mean, like say that idea of nation and great nationalism came in, and anyone who dared to question the logic of nuclear weapons, those were branded lesser Indians and lesser Pakistanis or traitors of sort. So now kind of said having to deal with that sort of branding in Pakistan, and so how do kind of say, where do peace activists, where do they draw their strength from? I mean, like, what are the kind of, are there any hopeful signs on the horizon for that movement?
No, I think things will not come soon. They will require a lot of work and a lot of effort by people. In case of Pakistan particularly, I think what I'm saying it may also be true for a society like India. In a society like Pakistan, it is true that since there aren't many things on which they can blow up their nationalism and try to be proud of things, whatever little thing they have, they are very proud of it. And they value it very much. I believe that makes it very difficult to sort of try and say that we should not be really proud of it, we should give it up. It becomes very, very difficult. And therefore it becomes a very, very simple and potent rallying call for the rulers. They can actually, rally people around it and say that we are so strong, we can do this and we can do that, and how dare you, you tell us this and how dare you tell us that, of course. But time and again, we get an opportunity to tell people that, look, you have these weapons, yet American forces can fly 2 hours inside, take Osama bin Laden, be at that place for 2 hours, and then fly out for another 2 hours, and you just do not know, or that your nuclear weapons become useless, or that the Taliban, who are now fighting against Pakistani forces, do not care that you are nuclear power, and they challenge you and hurt you as so badly that you have lost so many thousand of your soldiers, more than any war or all wars put together. And yet all these weapons are helpless. So what they have created is a kind of an abstract notion which is not very useful in the real life. So one can say there are those things. But I think because it is such a good rallying call, and people sort of get a lot of comfort by knowing that there are these things at least we can be proud of. Of course, we cannot be proud of Abdul Salam because he sort of has that kind of faith we do not like, or we cannot be proud of Malala Yousafzai because she is of that kind and of that kind. But this is something which I think is something people are can be relied upon to be very proud of.
Thank you. Dr. Reddy, I mean, like, in a way, this is pretty much, I mean, like what question to Nayyar sir was and what his response. I mean, probably, I mean, like I would say that can carry over conversation and even in Indian context. And I'm just thinking, because you very kind of nicely laid the scene that about 300 different kind of, say, the news channels. And again, to my last count in Pakistan, it was about 70 or so, something of regional and another news channels. And what I'm thinking, I mean, like, say, like, say, the childhood time, that when there was only one PTV or the Pakistan television, and for it had kind of, say, the 20 minutes to basically nail down how it wanted us to think on that main news bulletin. And likewise, Doordarshan in India. Now, in that, I mean, like I said, it was one way that, okay, I mean, like I said, the state basically controlled the electronic media. But these days, when one just gets a glimpse of Indian or Pakistani mainstream, what I think they call themselves news channels, but mostly they are kind of views channels. So now one is sort of, I mean, like if you want to challenge and if you want to see through as to what is happening, now instead of having to deal with one Doordarshan or one PTV, one is stuck with, say, dozens of those type of channels. And that, so, and to me, I mean, like I said, my personal experience was that when I went to teach in Pakistan last year, after a while, the students who come there, those TV channels, they are, even for the educated people, I mean, like say, who are entering into some of the prime universities, their main source of information are those news channels about world, about their own country's politics and world politics. In that scenario, I mean, how do people really kind of inculcate or go for the critical thinking? I mean, like, how does one try to even achieve that?
It's a tough question. It's just that I think we must try and make use of whatever little spaces, few spaces are available. In India, for example, there are a few online news sites which give a different point of view, which try to maintain the traditions of journalism. And because the costs of running a website have come down so much, it's possible not only for those who want to wreak havoc to use that medium, but also for those who want to maintain a healthy media perspective. I know that seems like just banking on hope, but there are, for example, in the past few years, there have been two news websites in English, which are small, but they're punching well above their weight, and they're not just echo chambers. They have caused enough discomfort to the government, to rattle them, etc.
For our audience, can you please just name them so that if they don't know, then at least they can kind of go on those websites? So
one is called scroll.in, which actually I'm associated part-time. The other is called thewire.in, THEWIRE.in. The latter is more political. It carries out more investigative stories, etc. But those are in English. But there are also small ones run by individuals, which try to contest it. And in fact, there is another one. There are a few services, websites, which have taken up the job of exposing fake news.
Yes.
There's one very well-known site, which just in 1 year, just 4 or 5 people, called altnews.in.
Yes.
And they have created more than ripples.
What's that?
Alt news.
Alt for alternative, but it's altnews.in. Alt news.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like that, there are a few initiatives here and there, but the battle is huge. And as I said at the end, it is not even these TV channels, which spew so much hate that are worrying, but it's WhatsApp.
Yes.
We know that some political parties, a few political organizations have built up groups of people to spread certain WhatsApp news, morph images, send out videos, etc., and to do so at particular points of time, just before elections, when things are a little, let's say, sensitive in certain areas to aggravate the situation. And they do that, and because of this end-to-end encryption that WhatsApp offers, which is, for our privacy, it's also something you can't trace, and they, the number of smartphones in India now is some 300 to 400 million, and it's increasing by about 20, 30 million every year. And it's very easy to spread that, and that's happening. So what is happening is people have begun to distrust mainstream media for a variety of reasons, because political parties have targeted them, or because of the practices of these media organizations themselves. The space has been opened up for WhatsApp. So as I said, just like here you're worried about Facebook and Twitter, there we are worried about WhatsApp, but nobody knows what to do. Alt news can only do so much. It cannot. At the most, it can expose 3-4 major items of fake news a day. And the problem is that incendiary WhatsApp message will reach about 50-60 million people in about a few days. So alt news may expose that, but that will not reach the same number of people.
Right.
So views get formed, they get set in stone, so it gets much more difficult. So, we're really, up against a monster, and we don't have any ideas of, how to deal with it. I mean, the state, what it does is whenever there's trouble somewhere, it cuts internet.
Yes.
Yeah, it cuts internet, cuts the old, it used to cut phone lines, now it cuts the internet. So to prevent,
Right. Yeah.
But even in normal times, there is this that is going on.
Okay. And so when I mean, like I said, of course, I mean, like I said, there will be many more questions from the audience. My question will be very simple about, as you mentioned, kind of the nationalism being, if I understood it correctly or paraphrased, that it is kind of a political project as well, right? That constantly that is being kind of constructed, made and remade and all that. And also, when you said that at least whether it was international left or even our national leftist movements in India or Pakistan, I mean, like say, given their status, when little bit that you see India under Modi and during Hindutva, and that version of Sleeping Beauty nationalism, and now kind of say waking up with its ferocity, seems that they're even like their main target seems to be Nehru and Nehruvian kind of say the variant of nationalism. So even with all its kind of say the faults or whatever limitations of Nehruvian idea of India, of the 1950s or 60s, when we're dealing with, say, this new juggernaut of almost kind of, say, brutal majoritarianism type of nationalism in India, what is kind of, say, what's the future of, because say, as I disagree with almost kind of many things with what Rammanohar writes, but when he says that, well, the last thing India wants to become is Hindu Pakistan, right? So, what is happening there, I think, I mean, like I said, on the Pakistani side, we are quite familiar with that kind of majoritarian or of nationalism instead of composite nationalism of sorts. So how do you see that kind of the battling panning out in the next few years or beyond?
Well, there are two aspects of your question as I see it. One is why is Hindutva become so strong? And the second aspect deals with the future and says that, what do you think about the future? Now, as I've often said, it's difficult to think systematically and seriously far ahead about the future. But, okay, let me take the future aspect first. The single biggest weakness of this regime lies in the area of the economy, alienation it puts forward, and so on. As far as the question of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism in a softer or other version, it's gaining increasing common sense. It's an hegemonizing influence. You had two hegemonies. One was the Congress hegemony, which was from 1947 till the mid-late 60s. You had a long interregnum, and then you have the emergence of this new kind of hegemonizing influence. It has its weak spots on the question of the economy, especially on the question of jobs, decent here. There is definitely going to be dissatisfaction. But the direction that dissatisfaction takes will be depending upon living politics. So it's an open-ended question over here. You can see the change in the general political culture milieu in the sense that very few people challenge it now on the question of its nationalism or nationalist assertiveness, right? And so, I mean, that's one thing. Second, secularism has come to mean, in the public view, a kind of appeasement. They have, to this extent, won that debate. If you talk about secularism, oh God, you're still talking about Muslims and all the rest of us. Yeah, they may be having our problems, but what about us? So it's not as if the majority of Hindus hate Muslims, but they're indifferent to the plight, or they have their own preoccupations. And if you start talking about secularism, it's like in the United States. It's not that all white people are racist, but if you talk about immigration, you talk about this, they say, what about us? So I think that's a factor. It can be fought, but it's a long-term fight because the ups and downs of the electoral process and whether BJP is in power or not is not enough. In my view, you have to defeat the far right. And the Indian far right is different from the far right in other liberal democracies. It has a continuous existence of 19 years. It has an implantation in civil society that is deeper by far than the Le Pens and the Denmark and others and so on. Yeah. Take something which is very interesting. This comes back to the past. How do you explain its rise? I would say, for example, that this is also related to the whole processes by which you had a Hindu Renaissance, a Hindu softer version of Hindu nationalism, your composite nationalism, which has never really been a serious opposition. Why? Ideologically speaking. Incidentally, the Nehruvian era of hegemony, after independence, the ideology of Nehruvianism of the Congress was a mishmash. It was a mishmash of secularism, modernization, scientific temper, non-alignment, this, that, etc. In contrast, the ideology of the forces of Hindutva have been consistent. And since 1947, very interesting, not only is no other party had been able to maintain the kind of cadre strength and commitment. Yes, the RSS was having problems in the 70s and then here, but for so long as they were able to do here. The BJP and its forerunner, the Jan Sangh, is the only political party in India that has never had a major split. If nothing else, it's an indication of their ideological cohesiveness. In 1947, the one force which had an implantation in terms of shakas there was, in fact, the RSS. Some years later, it became the biggest voluntary association in India. And as for this question of composite culture, take these two terms. One, the Congress loves to use, and the other is the RSS, BJP. The BJP, RSS, to make India strong, unity of Hindus. What's your composite culture? India is this unity in diversity. This unity in diversity, from which we get a composite culture which should give rise to a composite nationalism. Where did this unity in diversity or this composite culture come? It's part of ancient India. Now, if it's part of ancient India, then clearly it precedes the Islamic emergence. So where are you going to point to some of the most incredible, important roots of this wonderful spirit? You know, Nehru talks about the great spirit of India. This is a kind of abstraction and all that. You have to handle this notion of spirit very carefully. I'm more inclined to material notions of spirit, like alcohol. Sorry. But my point is here, is that this idea itself here, if you're going to defend it, and Nehru did more than that. He said, look at the contribution of Buddhism, look at the contribution of Mughals and all. But you still have to take into consideration something more ancient, because it's so ancient, which means you're going to emphasize Vedic, Brahmanical Hindus of some particular kind. So that dimension was always there. The Congress had all kinds of forces, from Sardar Patel, Madan Mohan Malviya, and Gandhi plays a bridging role. So even that period was not a seriously strong, in my view, obviously much better. So I see the problem as much more longer rooted, but that puts me in a very different position from Ram Gu and the others, of course, who dismiss us as you lefties, you're not serious. We have a much better understanding of the Congress movement and of the nature of Indian society. I don't want to discredit Nehru and all the rest of it, but I'm far more critical of the national movement of Nehru, Gandhi, and others than the liberal tradition represented by Ram Goa, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, and others. Although, of course, today they're very much allies in our common struggle.
Thank you very much. We're going to open the floor for questions, but please, I mean, like say, because we don't have the wireless mic, so you may have to kind of, on both sides, you may have, because we want your questions to be recorded as well, so the answers make sense. So please, I mean, like say, it's Imtiaz from me, and then Ramana, they'll start with their, sorry? Yeah.
You want us to come down?
Or maybe, I mean, like, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is sorry I came late, so I didn't hear all the presentations, but what I'm hearing is a very dangerous situation. I know you talk about Hindu nationalism and the rising of the sleeping beauty and the so-called ancient traditions. Of course, Adivasis are not considered ancient because it's not Hindu. But the dangerous thing is that using this Hindu nationalism and demonization of Muslims, particularly drawing on the rise of Islamophobia, is very dangerous, I think, in the sense, particularly the global Islamophobia. And I think that the BJP government is perhaps tinkering with a lot of danger by using this demonization and Islamophobia, and then rubbing against Muslim extremists and Taliban and so on, and it really puts the question mark on the trigger, right? In the sense of who has access to the trigger, of the nuclear trigger of what is possible of any peace, whether it's Kashmir or what's happening in Balochistan or other places in terms of prospects of peace. Thanks.
This is a question addressed to Achin. So I like the point you made about nationalism and how strong it is, and I was reminded of something that a friend of Zia's and mine, Tarak Barkawi, used to do in his classes, which is that he would ask his students to explain why nationalism is such a powerful force. He would ask them, how many of you are willing to risk death for love? And maybe one or two people would put up their hands, and then somebody would ask something, similar kind of questions for religion, for this thing. You'd ask, how many of you will can imagine risking death for the nation? And of course, many people have to put up their hands because lots of people become soldiers. So they are actually doing that. But the question I have for you is, so is this something you've kind of taught us or told us that it's a very dangerous phenomenon in a sense, or it's a very difficult phenomenon to deal with and has this sort of dark side, as it were? in the sense of, if you compare, and you also talked about capitalism and the sort of the neoliberal phase of capitalism, as you might say, and some of us see that that phase is not something which you can revert back to the earlier kind of the 50s, 60s kind of more social democratic phase, and this is a one-way street essentially. In the case of nationalism, do you see the current phase of much more populist or right-wing nationalism as compared to the more Nehruvian type older secular nationalisms? Is this a one-way street as well? Can you think we can move back to that kind of a...
Okay, let me just, well, with regard to the question whether I see this as a one-way street, no. You also had left-wing nationalisms in certain parts of the world. A left-wing populism, a certain element of it in the United States, in UK, but elsewhere, Portugal, Greece to a certain extent, Ireland. These are also places which you've had that here. And it's the discontent among young people in the future is going to shape that here. So I think, yes, the problems of neoliberal capitalism, and I agree with you that this is the only kind of capitalism we have, with variations. Disciplinary capitalism, disciplinary neoliberalism or compensatory neoliberalism, neoliberalism with a somewhat human face, this, that, etc. here. But it's not going to be able to address the kind of problems you have, and therefore there'll be attempts. So it's not a one-way seat. The other question which is important, which you didn't really ask, but I'd like to address, is why is... Sorry, I won't. I'll keep that.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, save it for later.
Yeah, I can save it for later.
Please go.
That's the question of why is nationalism so powerful? Right? Let me try and go about it in a somewhat roundabout way. I believe in a universal humanity. I believe that we all have the capacity to have multiple identities and to think beyond ourselves. Support women if we're men, support lower caste if we're upper caste, so on. Vietnam War, all the rest of it. At the same time as one believes in a universal humanity, the only way of being human is to be a particular human. So what does this mean? It means that we can't get away from seeking to locate ourselves for our own psychic health, in my understanding, in a particular time and place. We can't avoid that. We are located in a particular time and place. But culture, or the capacity, what is culture which all human beings have? For me, culture is best understood as a capacity for symbolic self-transcendence. Symbolic self-transcendence of what? To have a sense of being beyond your particular time and space. What is it that provides that sense of location and that capacity to go beyond that? Religion has been one source, because we all have to deal with the problem of mortality. Therefore, what happens is that everybody needs some kind of a community of belonging. And you have different kinds of community of belonging, family, this, that, etc. The imagined communities of religion, nationalism, wider, spacious. So one can understand why that is so important as a sense of community of belonging. But why is the community of belonging of nationalism more powerful, in my view, than religion and others? And this is where the political dimension comes in. On one hand, the point you make, people don't want to die for the struggle for socialism or for international systems to the same extent. They're prepared to die for two things, their religion and their nation. That powerful thing. The political dimension of nationalism, which emerged, is something that is very, very important, because all nationalisms, whether they are dictatorial or democratic, there are two concepts. One is the concept of popular sovereignty. The people are sovereign. The nation state is very different from the states of the past. It is supposed to belong to the people, so that even Musharraf has to say that, look, I'm in power not because of my family, but for the people of Pakistan. That is an empowering thing. The other aspect is, of course, that people equally are citizens. There's a kind of horizontal principle of equality which is here. So politically speaking, the nation state is the most powerful political unit which, because of the adhesive of support from that here. One of the things in India, and I'll end over here, I could say a lot more, but that in the Indian context, one thing is that people in India believe in polls, in democracy to that limited extent, and that's a very powerful constraining factor for the BJP here. The BJP wants to inferiorize Muslims, Christians, kick out the leftists, but it wants to unify Hindus. It can't really move without powerful restraint against the idea of eliminating the civil rights and restoring a kind of authoritarianism for all Hindus, for Dalits, this, that, etc. here. And therefore, I think this political dimension is very empowering, distinctive to nationalism as a political unit. And just note, the most important effort to go beyond it, which is the European Union, has not succeeded. Germany is the most important force over there. All your international bodies, from the World Bank to this, that, are multilateral bodies in which the relationship of forces between the most important nation states is crucial. Can we overcome it? We have to overcome it. To my mind, you maybe dismiss this as a view. I think that we can only overcome it when we move towards transcending capitalism, and that's another argument which I won't go into, and that's the question of the functionality of the nation-state system for capitalism. So if we want to go beyond the nation-state, we have to take up the question of capitalism. And I can be, as a lifelong Marxist, believe me, I can be wrong about everything. Sorry.
I have a bit of a roundabout question. I haven't organized my thoughts very well. So I grew up here in Canada as a Japanese Canadian, and I believe that the racism that I've put up with has a lot to do with the beginning of nuclear power. So I became an aerospace engineer because I loved physics and thought that I could change the world through these means. And also, during my time at university, I was the editor of the engineering newspaper. And I also thought that that was an outlet that I could use. Now, I use those skills in union organizing, where I fight capitalism as hard as I can. Other than an analysis that you have, which obviously is a very educated and well thought out analysis, what is the other form of hope that is there, which was kind of posed as a question to Dr. Hamid, I think, already. But to expand for all of you, what is the other side that gives you a bit of hope?
When Achin talked about his 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and that kind of thing, the world order, if you want to call it that, as we know it, in terms of the system of states and so on, basically gets constituted at the end of World War II. And the structure and set of ideas that is given to it is encoded in the structure and charter of the United Nations. And it says in the opening words that the purpose of the United Nations is to free humanity from the scourge of war. 193 states, nation states, with all their nationalisms and all their histories of everything that has ever happened to them before and their imaginations of the future, all signed up for this. It's actually a really big deal. They didn't have to, nobody made them do it. But they all signed up to do it. And the first decision they ever made in the United Nations, before they even agreed on what are the official languages of the United Nations, Resolution 1 is the abolition of nuclear weapons. Of all the horrors of World War II, entire continent destroyed, tens of millions of people dead, 70 Japanese cities burnt to the ground, and endless need for directing human attention, priorities, and capabilities to reconstruction and so many other things that needed to be fixed. Resolution 1. Nuclear weapons are so bad we have to have a plan to abolish them. That is the first and primary task. Last year, they passed a treaty with 122 countries in the room at the United Nations on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, despite the opposition of the most powerful military and economic states in the world order. The Americans didn't want it, the British didn't want it, the French didn't want it, the Russians didn't want it, the Chinese didn't want it, the Indians, Pakistanis, Israelis, North Koreans, they all stayed away. But the 5 big ones actively opposed it as a threat to the way the world is. And the other countries did it anyway. It is an unprecedented effort. So you can't ask for more than that, I think, really, as a sign of hope that change is possible.
Well, I think there is hope. 28 May, we had our explosions, but on 28 May, our peacenik Zahid Makhdoom was born. So there is some hope. It was his birthday. Anyway, my question or comment is that with nation state, there are some who then assume the role of being guardians of that nation state. And those guardians, in the case of, let's say, Pakistan, or on the other side also, initially the idea was also sold as something that will lead to reduced defense spending. Now, with the nuclear development there, those guardians actually saw that its logical conclusion that reduction of expenditure will actually reduce their role. And therefore, this nuclear expansion has to continue, and the other expenditure has also been increasing. The nuclear expenditures are usually too secret to be divulged, so we don't know how much is spent on that, and the normal spending continues to grow. So there are these interests that actually also stand in the way of creating the problem that we have. Your comments?
Yeah, I mean, there's, as I tried to say, you know, it was perfectly predictable that once you get nuclear weapons and blow them up, there will be military units that are responsible, scientific institutions that are responsible, and there will be budgets and careers and investments and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this happens in all nuclear weapon states. Right? I mean, the United States and all the other countries that made nuclear weapons, at some stage they all internally had this argument about how, you know, nuclear weapons will allow some kind of reduction in conventional military spending because you get greater efficiency of destruction, more bang for the buck and so on with nuclear weapons. But all of them ended up keeping both big militaries and building up nuclear weapons. And it continues to this day. So what they're doing is no surprise whatsoever. And especially when you keep in mind that typically nuclear weapons budgets are on the order of some percent, up to 10 or so percent of total military budgets, right? And whether that's the United States, Britain, France, and so on, as far as we can judge, it's typically of that order. So they add no great overwhelming financial burden on states that their conventional military investments don't already pose. And that drives the question that, you know, the money by itself is not an issue that you can use to add this. What you do get, as you know, is happening in the debate in Britain, for example, is that the cost of big, new, modern nuclear weapon systems, when you have to replace everything, can become very large. The US is planning to spend on the order of $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years on modernizing all of its nuclear weapons, and its submarines, and its missiles, and its factories, and everything else. And Britain is going to spend a lot of money too. And there you see a split between the Army and the Navy and the nuclear weapons people, because the Army and the Navy want tanks and ships and submarines for conventional military operations, And you can buy a lot of those for the money that goes to nuclear weapons also. So there are internal tensions that emerge eventually. But those happen every so often, once in a generation, where very large capital expenditure projects have to be committed that will use money for long periods of time going forward. But on a year-by-year basis, it's completely normal to see the nuclear weapons budget be a small fraction of total military budgets. And so no one has ever actually, successfully managed to use the money argument to get a grip on this question.
So I guess on that note, we will kind of conclude this panel discussion. And once again, I would like to thank all four of you that you took your time out. And I'll simply say that whenever our aerospace friend or ourselves, whenever we are talking or asking that, where do you see the hope? Do you see anything? Probably, through that question, we just wanted to learn from you people that in sometimes, in these rather desperate and darker times, where should we be what should we be looking forward to? So thank you very much once again for joining us.
July 1945. The United States of America tested the first atomic bomb. Even the scientists who built it were shocked by its destructive power. Overwhelmed by the terrible force they had released, the leader of the scientists exclaimed, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." These fateful words ushered in the nuclear age. At war with Japan, the United States soon decided to use its new weapon. The test had only been the beginning. The bomb was there to be used. On the 6th of August 1945, the United States of America dropped an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Just 3 days later, on the 9th of August, it dropped yet another over the city of Nagasaki. The cities were destroyed. 1 out of every 3 persons was killed immediately. Many more were injured and suffered slow, painful deaths over days and months and years. The Soviet Union, seeing what the United States had done, made its own weapons. Driven by hostility and fear, the two countries raced to make more and bigger bombs. The world shook as they tested their new weapons. Soon others followed: Britain, France, and China. Israel too made a bomb, but kept it untested. The rest of the world looked on in horror and demanded an end to the testing of nuclear weapons. The struggle to ban the bomb had barely begun. But in May 1998, the bomb found a new home. The Rajasthan desert heaved as India carried out 5 atomic tests. The subcontinent had changed forever. The 5 tests added to the one India had carried out 24 years earlier. Among the new tests was that of a hydrogen bomb, claimed to be many times more powerful than the fission weapon that had leveled Hiroshima. India's Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, spoke proudly of having the big bomb, a long-standing ambition of his right-wing nationalist political party was being realized. For some, there was pride in the new status of nuclear India. they celebrated with abandon. But thoughtful Indians protested the profound mistake their government had made by testing.
Nuclear weapons are evil, they are destructive, and I think my position has become much clearer and much stronger after recent events.
Aware of the deadly power of the bomb, many felt that the tests had done no good to India.
So on the moral plane it lost ground. On the economic plane, I think it has lost tremendous ground, because all this will mean now getting engaged in a kind of an investment on building up a nuclear arsenal, and that's going to be economically counterproductive. Politically, I think the expectations that they would suddenly get internationally and otherwise actually didn't work out. So I think all in all, it has not been at all helpful. If anything, it has worsened the regional security situation.
But only 17 days later, the Chari mountains of Balochistan saw the predictable but tragic sequel to India's tests. As Pakistan set off its own nuclear devices, the mountain shook and turned white from the blast. Many celebrated, but some Pakistanis understood that their country could have gained much by not testing.
In the first place, Pakistan would have achieved a moral superiority over India, and that would have gone very well with the donors, bilateral as well multilateral donors. Everybody knew that Pakistan had the capability, so they would have thought that this is a great gesture by Pakistan, very brave gesture by Pakistan. And they would have come to our assistance, and they would have taken India to task for, they would have singled out India for the punishment, and we would have been spared of all the consequences we are still facing.
Nonetheless, as India had done, Pakistan's government claimed the nuclear tests as the nation's greatest achievement. It even built monuments of the test site in several cities. In India, the media had lavished praise on those who had built the bomb. The Prime Minister added to the traditional Indian salute to workers and peasants a new slogan, "Hail the scientists." In Pakistan, similar forces went to work as well. New scientific heroes were created. The builders of the bomb became household names. Even public places were renamed to honor these individuals. But the spontaneity of such celebrations is disputable.
There's complete control of the government on the media in Pakistan, electronic media particularly. On television and on radio, and hence the public opinion is very easily molded in the direction that the government desires. And there has been an enormous amount of work that the government has done in molding public opinion in the direction in favor of the bomb. Bomb is projected as, number one, a huge achievement in technological terms. It is also projected as a sure sign of obtaining security of the country.
Pakistan's successful nuclear tests created a notion that it was now a technologically advanced country. But this is a dubious claim. Today, the making of atom bombs has become much easier. The first atomic bomb was a tremendous scientific and technological achievement. It required the finest minds in the world to smash the atom and to get the energy out of it and to create a self-sustaining chain reaction. But no longer. Now, you have all this information in books, in journals, and even on the internet. So today, almost any country in the world, leave aside Somalia and Rwanda, but any other can make bombs. The only thing that you need is money. Building and testing the bomb is only the first step. To be used as a weapon, it needs to have a way to reach its target. India has developed its Prithvi missile, which can carry a nuclear weapon several hundred kilometers and can reach anywhere in Pakistan within a few minutes. It is, in fact, Pakistan specific. There is also the longer-range Agni missile, which can carry a nuclear warhead over 2,500 kilometers. Even longer-range missiles are being planned. As bomb followed bomb, so missile bred missile. Pakistan has made and tested ballistic missiles of its own. These missiles can carry a nuclear warhead over 1,000 kilometers. The solid-fuel Shaheen missile takes little preparation time, but even the liquid-fuel Gauri can be sent quickly on its deadly path.
This missile doesn't take more than 2 hours. The Gauri missile, yes, within 2 hours we can fire it.
As with the bomb, the missiles have spawned public monuments in Pakistan. These are projected as symbols of scientific and technological achievement. But the truth lies elsewhere, as even their makers occasionally admit.
80% to 90% technology is available in literature, and if you really get down to work, you have to solve those 10-15%. It's only the money is required and the priority which any government can set on it.
A deadly logic is now at work. Newer and more accurate missiles, more and more bombs. India and Pakistan are straining to build up their arsenals. This full-blown arms race has disproved claims that nuclear weapons would stabilize their competition. There was a time when generals in Pakistan used to say, one bomb for Delhi, one for Bombay. That is enough to deter the Indians. And the same argument used to be made from the Indian side, enough to just take out Pakistan's cities. But now no longer. Now Dr. A.Q. Khan has gone on record saying that Pakistan has enough bombs to take out all of India's cities, not once, but twice. There is an inevitable logic to this escalation. More bombs, more missiles, measures, countermeasures, ballistic missiles to hit ballistic missiles, to counter them, radars, and so on and so forth. There is no limit to this. Minimal deterrence has been shown to be a completely wrong concept. The world has seen this kind of race before. A foolish belief that national security depended upon building more bombs locked the United States and Soviet Union in a hostile competition. They made thousands of nuclear weapons of all shapes and sizes, fission and fusion. The most sophisticated and expensive technologies were used to build delivery vehicles for nuclear weapons. The United States spent more than $5,500 billion on weaponry between 1945 and 1990. The Soviet Union tried to follow suit, but with its economy ruined, it ultimately collapsed. The atomic bomb had shown yet another way to destroy a country. An arms race between India and Pakistan may well cause Pakistan to face a similar fate. About 1 out of every 3 Pakistanis now lives below the poverty line. Many face a desperate daily struggle to survive and provide for their children. They can only dream of having a decent job, of educating their children, of even getting enough clean water. For years, Pakistan's military expenditure has exceeded its spending on development. As India repeatedly increased its military budget, Pakistan invariably followed suit. The nuclear tests also led to international sanctions that worsened Pakistan's already dire economic crisis.
Most of the people who are in control of the country and the economy today, they are blaming the previous governments for the mess we are in today. But I would identify the fallout of the nuclear testing as the main reason for the crisis we are in today.
In nuclear Pakistan, people must now fend for themselves. There is little that the government has to give to them.
सवारी बहुत कम हो गई है इस वजह से कि 28 मई के जो धमाके हुए हैं उसके बाद कारोबार पे बहुत ज़्यादा असर पड़ा है महंगाई होने की वजह से हमारी सवारी बहुत कम हो गई है लोग बसों पे जाते हैं वैगनों पे चले जाते हैं इसलिए हमारे कारोबार पे बहुत ज़्यादा बुरा असर पड़ा है
मेरे ख्याल में जब 28 मई को धमाका हुआ उसके बाद अगर आप अपनी मईशत पे गौर करें तो बहुत पीछे गई है अगर आप देखें तो महंगाई में बहुत ज़्यादा इजाफा हुआ है और इस कदर हम पे पाबंदियाँ लगी हैं और हम मेरे ख्याल में तो बहुत पीछे गए हैं इकोनॉमिकली तो हम बहुत पीछे गए हैं
Out of every 100 rupees spent by the government, the military took 38. Another 48 went for repaying loans, many of which were taken for buying weapons. This left only 14 rupees for meeting people's basic needs such as education, health, jobs, or for rural development.
If you want nuclear capability, then forget the people. Because the people will go hungry, you will not be able to provide for them.
The atom bomb has had many other lessons for both Pakistan and India. The gravest of these has been that it cannot bring peace. The visit by India's Prime Minister to Lahore raised hopes that relations might improve, but these hopes proved to be short-lived.
Both sides have thought that by virtue of their having this capability, they would be able to resolve their disputes according to their own advantage, which has not happened. In fact, it has given both sides a false sense of confidence.
Just 1 year after the tests, intense fighting erupted along the line of control in the Kargil area of Kashmir. The battles on the cold high mountains raged for months. About 3,000 soldiers fought and died. The Kargil War was the first war in history that was actually caused by nuclear weapons. Let me explain this. When Pakistan tested nuclear weapons in May 1998, it felt so secure that it felt that it could pursue foreign policy objectives with regard to India without Indian retaliation. So subsequently, Pakistan sent forces disguised across the border, and although it knew that India would want to respond, yet the nuclear shield would prevent it from doing so. Therefore, what we have seen is the initiation of a war because Pakistan felt that the nuclear shield would deter the Indians from attacking Pakistan across the line of control or across the international border out of fear of nuclear weapons. As the war escalated and threatened to spread, Pakistan eventually pulled back its forces from the line of control. There was outrage from jihadi leaders. For them, there could not be any compromise.
It is a betrayal. Betrayal. It is a betrayal, my brother.
The Kargil War disproved the oldest claim about nuclear weapons. It showed that two nuclear-armed states could have more than just a Cold War.
So there will be no war between India and Pakistan so far as the nuclear war is concerned. But under the nuclear umbrella, conventional war and use of conventional forces will continue to be there.
Kargil offers a window into the future. Once war begins, it cannot easily be controlled. During Kargil, there were demands to wage war with greater force. Nuclear threats were hurled in both directions.
जिस पाकिस्तान के पास आज शाहीन और गौरी भी है, जिस पाकिस्तान के पास आज एटम बम भी मौजूद है.
On the streets, militant Islamic groups saw in the atom bomb and the missiles signs of Pakistan's strength. They reveled in its possibilities. For them, Pakistan was now an invulnerable fortress. Each of these militant groups is more sectarian and violent than the next. Today, they represent a dangerous new force in the country.
हम में से हर शख्स खुद लड़ने के लिए मैदान में निकल आए. बहुत हो चुके अमन पसंदी के दावे, बहुत इज्जतें और इस्मतें हमने लुटवा दी, बहुत कुछ खो चुके हैं हम. अब हम में से हर शख्स को मुसल्ला होकर मैदान में आना होगा.
Jihadists challenged the government by openly displaying their lethal weapons. The breeding grounds of this new threat are the madrasas. Here, poor children are turned into holy warriors, taught nothing about the modern world except how to use its tools of war. Prepared and willing to die or kill for their cause, they await their leader's call to war. It may come at any time and be directed any place. Jihadi forces see in Pakistan's atomic bomb and in its ballistic missiles a means to realize their grandest vision. They have claimed the bomb for Islam, and this notion is now becoming popular.
जहाँ तक पाकिस्तान की एटमी सलाहियत का ताल्लुक है, मैं समझता हूँ कि ये पाकिस्तान ही का नहीं बल्कि ये मुसलमानों का हक है और मुसलमानों को अपने दिफा के लिए और अपने हकूक़ के दिफा के लिए इसको हासिल करना चाहिए.
जिस तरह यूरोप और मगरबी अक़वाम मुख्तलिफ़ तरीक़ों से एटमी सलाहियतों में एक दूसरे की मदद कर रही हैं, बताते नहीं हैं, लेकिन फ्रांस औरों के साथ एक दूसरे को सब इज्तिमाई तौर पर एक मजबूत बना रहे हैं. कभी केमिकल चीज़ें, कभी वो जो उसके अज्जा होते हैं, वो हर चीज़ों में एक दूसरे को खुफिया मदद करते हैं. टेक्नोलॉजी और साइंस एटमी एक दूसरे को देते हैं. तो हमें भी फिर इससे कोई झिझकना नहीं चाहिए. बड़ी खुशी की बात होगी कि मगरबी अक़वाम की तरह सारे इस्लामी ममालिक भी एटमी सलाहियत से गोया मुसल्लह हो जाएं.
But it is the conflict over Kashmir, not pan-Islamism, that largely fuels Pakistan's desire for the bomb. This bloody and tragic undeclared war rages on, guaranteeing that the two countries will persist in acts of mutual violence. Soon after Kargil, India shot down an unarmed Pakistani reconnaissance plane that was flying close to the border. 16 valuable lives were lost. Strong emotions of anger and sorrow surged. India claims that the plane was flying close to the border and was spying. Pakistan denies it.
It is very hard to say what the facts of the case are. But what is absolutely certain is that Pakistan sued India in the International Court of Justice for an amount of $60 million. Now, Pakistan's universities annually need $30 million, all of them, for their budgets, which means that this one single aircraft was equivalent to 2 years of Pakistan's total expenses for all its universities. This shows how criminally expensive the arms race is and how much India and Pakistan are spending on weapons of destruction. Furthermore, it also tells us that incidents of this type are going to occur again and again. For example, the hijacking incident And there will be more incidents in the future. The dangers are very great.
In a major incident or in the middle of conflict, surrounded by inflamed public nationalism and militant groups, it may be hard for leaders to make sensible decisions. The risk of making a mistake will be great. Leaders will fear that negotiation with the enemy will be regarded as cowardice by their own people. But with atomic bombs, the consequences of a mistake can be catastrophic. In the subcontinent, geography has its own fatal pressures. India and Pakistan share a long border. Their cities are only a few hundred kilometers away from each other at most. On the other hand, the fierce power of its rocket engine can shoot a ballistic missile hundreds of kilometers in just a few minutes. Its terrible speed across the sky and the short distances it has to travel means that there is always the danger of a surprise attack. A missile that is launched by one side would need to be quickly detected by the other. The warning of an attack would need to be urgently sent up the chain of command. The political and military leaders would need to decide if the attack was real or otherwise. If the decision is to fire off their own nuclear weapons, then the orders to fire would have to be issued. By then, it may be too late. A likely solution is to launch on warning, without checking, without thinking, without weighing consequences. Missiles cannot be recalled after being launched. Their fierce speed and deadly warhead leave little option but to keep one's weapons alerted. But this greatly increases the chances of unauthorized use or a nuclear accident.
There have been accidents involving nuclear weapons in every country that has had nuclear weapons. The United States, we know, has had hundreds of nuclear weapons accidents. Nuclear weapons have fallen off airplanes. Nuclear weapons on top of ballistic missiles have caught fire. Nuclear weapons on submarines and ships have sunk to the bottom of the sea. And in many of these cases, we now know that almost all the safety systems failed. And then it's only a matter of luck, not of planning, not of technology, but luck that has saved a major nuclear weapons accident from killing perhaps thousands of people.
The fear of a surprise attack by the adversary means that there may be little time to think and debate a response. Therefore, the procedure for launching nuclear weapons will have to be simple and hence of doubtful safety.
There is no such a thing as a safe command and control system. Suppose that Pakistan decides to keep all its missiles and bombs in one place. Obviously, it will not do that because one Indian bomb could knock all of them out. Therefore, it must disperse the missiles. But not only must it disperse the missiles, it must also disperse the authority, delegate authority to the people in charge of those missiles. So, should a nuclear war occur, it may well be that the order is not given by the chief executive or the Prime Minister of India or whoever. That decision may be taken by a brigadier who will make the decision whether you and I are to live or die.
Nuclear war could start either by chance or by deliberate decision. Imagine an atomic bomb dropped on a city. As the bomb explodes, it would destroy everything for miles around. It would feel like the end of the world. Hiroshima has seen all this for real. The first journalist to reach the city arrived 30 days after it had been destroyed. He wrote, The damage is far greater than the photographs can show. You can look around for 25 and perhaps 30 square miles. You can see hardly a building. There's just nothing standing. He saw people dying from radiation, their hair falling out, bleeding from the ears, nose and mouth. 30 days after the bomb, people were still dying at the rate of 100 a day. It is not only a city that is obliterated by a nuclear weapon. The effects can spread far beyond the target. A deadly mix of radioactive dust and gas is produced by the explosion. This lethal cloud is blown by the wind and falls back to earth as black rain. It poisons everything it touches with radioactivity. If either India or Pakistan were ever to use a nuclear weapon against the other's city, that city would surely be destroyed. But the radioactivity would be blown by the wind. Black rain would fall. It could easily fall on the country that had sent the bomb over.
Use of nuclear weapons would undoubtedly entail a suicide for both countries. And surely it will inflict a much greater damage to Pakistan than to India, just for the simple reason that India has a much larger size.
When India tested its nuclear weapons in May 1998, not everyone celebrated. There were many that realized the great dangers that the atom bomb had created and protested against it. A realization of nuclear dangers is also growing in Pakistan.
All I know is that ever since we have experimented with it, we have become poorer and poorer and poorer, and our armies have become more powerful and more powerful. The people who are hawkish have become more hawkish, and the liberals have been marginalized. That is bad for any society.
Today, Pakistan's people want a better life, not bombs. The bomb has provided them no security, no peace. Some demand change.
Pakistani peace movement demands from the government of Pakistan that number one, the government should stop making nuclear weapons. Number two, it should stop deploying nuclear weapons. It should not deploy nuclear weapons. Number three, it should make peace with India.
We all know now what the bomb can do. The dangers are beyond measure, and the lessons of history completely unequivocal. India and Pakistan must give up their atom bombs. They must make peace. We have no other choice.